About 31 years ago, I came to Japan, and I see a few people that were here at that time, or arrived shortly after. But there's been a lot of turnover in the time that I've been here, and that's part of the nature of living as a foreigner in Osaka. But when I first came to Japan, I didn't really know that I was going to be coming here. Some of you may have heard my testimony before. But basically, I was asked to originally go to serve in Korea. And through a loss of paperwork and contact information, that didn't turn out. And when I didn't get any information from Korea after a while, I contacted the local chaplain's office who had arranged the initial call. And they contacted the GC, and then they got back to me, oh, your paperwork was lost, but we have another alternative for you. And yeah, maybe a week or two later, I got a call from the director of Japan at that time, Roy Casabono. And he was like, oh, you don't know me and I don't know you, but I got your name, and we need people, would you be willing to come here? And so I agreed to come to Japan, and I didn't really know anything about Osaka. The only thing I knew about Osaka was my printer was made there. On the side of my printer box it said made in Osaka. It's a Panasonic printer. So that's the first time that I ever saw the word Osaka was on the side of my printer box. So I knew nothing about Osaka when I first agreed to come here. But yeah, I came and served, and it's been a good experience. When I came, I didn't know how long I was going to stay. Originally, I was recruited to come and work for a 4 or 5 year period of time, but that didn't work out for a variety of reasons. And I ended up working 3 years for the church here at the English school, and then went into work at other companies and schools, and continued helping out with the English church. But I ended up staying a lot longer than I planned. Sometimes people ask me, well, do you think you'll go back to America someday? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I have an apartment here now, and I'm married, I have 2 kids, so it's kind of unlikely that I'll leave anytime soon. But I don't know what will happen in the future. That's in God's hands. Today, I'd like to talk with you about one of the more famous characters from the Bible and of the Old Testament, Abraham. I'm sure everybody knows Abraham. One of the most famous patriarchs, the first of the patriarchs after the flood, really. So today, I'd like to look a little bit at his life and times, and look at a few of his experiences and how they relate to us today. Abraham was the 10th generation from Noah. He was born in the city of Ur. Ur was at that time one of the biggest cities in the Middle East. It was located at that time on the Persian Gulf. It was a trading center and political center and religious center in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, on the banks of the Euphrates and the Gulf. And today, if you were going to think of a comparable city, you might think of someplace like London or New York. It was a cultural center of the ancient world. And Abraham's family was living there in the area of Ur. And Abraham had heard the stories of God and how he had worked with man from his father Terah, and also probably from his great-great-great-grandfather Shem, one of the sons of Noah, who lived down until the time of Abraham and only died a little after, a few years after he was born. And so Abraham grew up in a family that knew the stories of God. And one day, Abraham's father, Terah, decided it was time to take the family out of Ur. They were going to leave and go someplace else. We don't know all the reasons why Terah made this decision. He was probably led in part by God. And so the family, which was quite extended at that time, left Ur, and they traveled up the Euphrates to about the bend of the Euphrates, for those of you who know the geography. And near there, they stopped because Terah became ill, and they remained there until he passed away. He did not recover from the illness. And so the family stopped and settled there in a town which became known as Haran, which was actually the name of Abraham's youngest brother, who died in Ur before they ever left. And so Abraham, his brother Nahor, and their families, they all settled here in this town named after his younger brother. And we don't know how long they stayed in this place, but God appeared to Abraham and called him to leave and go, and God would show him where he would settle. Now, how many people like to move? Okay, one or two hands. Yeah, I don't like moving. Most Americans move quite a few times. The average is 6 times for most Americans. And I've moved more than that already in my life. I've moved 4 or 5 times just in Japan, from place to place. In America, I moved 3 or 4 times. But I hate moving. In fact, when I was in university, I didn't go home during the summer because I didn't want to have to pack. I just stayed and worked at campus because I didn't want to have to pack up and all my stuff and carry it home and pack it up and bring it back. But usually when we move, we know where we're going. And even when I came to Japan, though I didn't know much about Osaka, I knew where I was going. And I knew that there was a place for me to stay. There were people here to welcome me. Abraham had none of that. He was simply told, go, and I will tell you where to go, when to stop. And, when people move around, it's more common when they're younger. I was 28 years old when I came to Japan, or 27 actually. When you're younger, you're more carefree and less attached and rootless. You don't have as many commitments, so it's easier to make these kinds of changes and transitions. But as we get older, that kind of change is not so easy. And Abraham, he was 75 years old when God called him to leave Haran. 75. Now, of course, people lived longer back then, but he still was not a young man. He was married. He didn't have any children, but he did have an extended community which relied on him. Servants, relatives, his nephew Lot, he was taken care of after the death of his younger brother. They had been successful, prosperous in Haran. To get up, sell what you had, transform that into something you could carry with you, that was not an easy thing to do. Now today when people want to move, you can call a company, right? You see these moving companies. They'll come and pack everything up for you and move and even unpack for you if you're willing to pay them the money. They didn't have any service like that back then. So Abraham had to gather his family together, his relatives, the people who were going with him, and organize this big move. And God directed him south to the land of Canaan. And Canaan, at the time of Abraham, was a beautiful place. It was a very well-watered, a very fertile land, but it was not exactly what we would call a tourist destination. The land of Canaan was divided up into many small city-states, small tribes and groups. The people were very warlike. It was not a peaceful place. They also had raiding from the desert. There were desert tribes that would come in and raid the lands. So it wasn't the safest, easiest place to live. And yet, Abraham didn't blink. He followed and did exactly what God directed. He went to Canaan. And on arrival there, God said, "This is the land that you're going to inherit, you and your descendants." He promised him the land. And Abraham, I'm sure, was kind of surprised. You know, the land was filled with other people. Other people were there. Other people were living there. And he still had no children himself. Who was going to inherit the land and fill the land? And yet, he trusted God. And for 10 years, Abraham traveled back and forth throughout the land of Canaan. He had flocks and herds. They couldn't stay in one place too long because the grazing and water would be used up. And so he had to move from place to place, living in tents with his family, followers. And sometimes he couldn't even stay in Canaan. On 2 instances, he had to actually leave the country. On one trip, he went to Egypt and stayed there for a while. And in Egypt, we see one of the human failings of Abraham, and that was he didn't always trust God as explicitly as he should. Abraham was married to his half-sister, Sarah, and she was a very beautiful woman. And so when he went to Egypt, they put on the pretense that, oh, she's just my sister. We're brother and sister. Because Abraham was worried that the Egyptians would covet his wife and kill him and take her away. And if you remember the story, Pharaoh did look at Sarah and, oh, you're not married? Fine, you can come and join my household. And it was only through God's intervention, punishment of Sarah, or of Pharaoh's household, that Pharaoh became wise to what had happened. And he was upset with Abraham and forced him and his family to leave the country. Even though Abraham trusted God in many cases, this particular situation he did not. And the same situation happened again years later when he went into the Philistine territory, again seeking a place to escape from famines. One of the Philistine kings who welcomed him and gave him shelter and flocks and water, Abimelech, he also, the same story, oh, she's only my sister. And again, Abimelech took Sarah into his household, the same story repeated. God appeared to Abimelech in a dream, and Abimelech wised up very quickly, returned Sarah to Abraham, and also scolded him for his deception, and had forced Abraham and his family to leave. And so even though Abraham often displayed great faith, there were also times of weakness. Lot and Abraham parted ways, as you remember. Abraham very humbly gave Lot the choice of which part of the land to take for his flocks and herds. Abraham was older. He was like a father to Lot, and yet he very humbly gave Lot first choice. He did not insist on claiming the precedent that he was entitled to. And if you remember, Lot chose the plains of Sodom and Gomorrah, the city of the plains. And so Abraham had took his flocks and herds up into the hill country and dwelt there. The land was not as fertile, there was not as much water, but God blessed him. And of course, Lot, first of all, he started living outside the city and then moved into the city, attracted by the excitement, the convenience of city life. And Lot and his family were captured by the Elamites when they came and attacked and fought against the kings of the plains. These men had rebelled against the king of Elam. And the kings of the plains were defeated. The Elamites captured the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they took all of these people, headed back to Mesopotamia with their loot. When Abraham was informed of this disaster, he did not delay. He summoned his household together. He called upon some of his neighbors that he was friendly with. And altogether, a force of about 1,000 men chased after this Elamite army. Now again, this required a little bit of faith. I mean, you're talking about a foreign army. There were probably several, well, more than several thousand, probably 10, 20, 30,000 men in that army. And while they weren't expecting attack, they were still outnumbered Abraham and his force by a great deal. And yet, Abraham trusted in God to be with him and to deliver the enemy into his hands. And much like Gideon would do later, there was a night attack. Abraham led his force against the Elamites, and in the night they routed and defeated the enemy. And they recaptured all of those who had been taken by the Elamites. And Abraham collected all of this loot. And in ancient times, to the victor go the spoils. Everything that was captured by right and by custom and by expectation belonged to Abraham as leader of that army. And yet, again, Abraham showed his generosity and his graciousness. He took nothing for himself except Lot and his family. He allowed his allies to take their share, and he returned everything that had been stolen back to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plains. Although he did pay a tithe to Melchizedek, a priest of God, who lived in Salem, later to become Jerusalem at that time. And so here Abraham demonstrated his generosity, his open heart, and his compassion for those who had suffered. Time passed, 10 more years, and Abraham still did not have any children, and God renewed the covenant with him that he was going to be the father of many nations. And Abraham began to think about this with his wife. How can we fulfill this promise? I'm getting older and older, and no children. And so he and his wife decided, well, God helps those who help themselves. And again, a little bit of lack of faith and trust was displayed by what Abraham and Sarah did. Abraham took Sarah's servant Hagar to be his wife, and she bore him a son, Ishmael. And Ishmael became the heir to the promise. And 13 years more passed, and Abraham and Sarah still had no children. Abraham was now 99 years old, and Sarah, she was maybe 90, 89 or 90. And God repeated the promise again, that from you and Sarah, you will have a son. And Abraham laughed. He's like, you've got to be kidding. That's unbelievable. I'm 99 years old. My wife's 90 years old. How can we have children at this age? And yet, God did not desist from the promise. And not long after that, 3 strangers passed through the area. And you know the story. Abraham welcomed them, invited them to come to his camp for refreshment, and extended hospitality to these men who were passing by. And they revealed themselves to Abraham. It was Christ and 2 angels. And they repeated the promise that Abraham and Sarah were going to have a child. And again, Sarah couldn't believe and laughed. And she was rebuked for her doubt. And more famously, the visitors talked with Abraham about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that God had judged these cities guilty. Their time had run out, and he was going to destroy these cities. And here again, Abraham showed his compassion and his intercession for these people. They were not related to him. While Lot was living in Sodom, the other people, they were strangers to him. They were just his neighbors. And yet, Abraham pleaded with Christ, starting with, well, if 50 righteous men can be found, the cities would be spared. And as he rethought, well, maybe not 50. And they ended up agreeing that if 10 righteous men were found in these cities, the cities would be spared. But of course, there were not 10 to be found, and the cities were destroyed. Though the angels took Lot and his family, his 2 daughters, and his wife out of the city, the wife, of course, did not obey directions, and she turned into a pillar of salt. But Lot and his daughters escaped. Although it's interesting that Lot in his pride refused to come back to Abraham. Instead, he lived in a cave in poverty. He'd lost everything. And he ended his life in disgrace. But, a year later, the promise was fulfilled and Isaac was born. And that rose new challenges for Abraham and his household. By this time, Ishmael was a teenager. He was about 14 years old. He had been the heir for 13 years. So there was hard feelings between Ishmael and his mother and Sarah. And because of this domestic discord, Hagar and Ishmael were forced to leave. It was not Abraham's desire. He was a compassionate and loving father. He didn't want to exile his wife and son. But God revealed to him that Sarah's choice was the better course, and so he reluctantly forced them to leave. And even though Ishmael and Hagar left the camp and had to go into the desert and face a difficult life, they still received blessings from God because of their relationship with Abraham. And Ishmael, being a descendant, direct son of Abraham, he was promised to be blessed, and from him many of the tribes of the Sinai and Arabia trace their descendants back, their ancestry back to Ishmael. Abraham lost his wife sometime later. Sarah passed away, and Abraham bought a small plot of land which included a cave, and that one piece of land was really the only thing that he effectively owned in the land of Canaan. And they used that plot of land as a burial place. and Sarah was buried there. Abraham remarried. Most people aren't always aware of that. He married another lady, and he had 6 other sons by this woman. And these men also became the fathers of various tribes and nations, helping to fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. Abraham lived to be 175 years old, and he witnessed the birth of his grandchildren, Jacob and Esau, and watched them grow up before passing away and finally being buried by his family in the same cave that he had purchased first for his wife. In both the New and the Old Testament, Abraham is viewed as a father of the faithful. The Jews were very proud of the fact that they were sons of Abraham and children of Abraham. And it was a point of dispute with Christ when he talked about them as, you are not sons of Abraham because you do not live as Abraham did. Instead, you are the son of Satan, the son of the devil, because your acts and actions match him and not Abraham, your blood ancestor. And in the New Testament, Abraham is also portrayed as the father of all the faithful. As Christians, the promise that was first made to Abraham was passed down. And Paul talks about this quite a bit in Romans and in Hebrews, that Abraham's faith and his justification by faith was a pattern that we should emulate ourselves. And of course, as we read in the scripture this morning, Abraham was one of the key examples of what Paul considered people who live by faith to demonstrate through their lives and actions. He left for a place he did not know. He had the promise of a son, even though he was old, far beyond the normal years. And yet he did trust in God to see these promises come to pass. If we look at the life of Abraham and think of the lessons that we can apply for ourselves, we need to have that same kind of faith, to go where God calls us to go, even though we don't always have all the details about where and when and what we will necessarily do when we get there. We may not all have the same strength of faith that Abraham had, but yet we can still trust in God to guide us and lead us each and every day. We know that as God led Abraham, so he can lead us. And even when things seem impossible by human standards, when we look at the life of Abraham, we see time and again how God gave him the way and the means to overcome the obstacles that presented themselves and to succeed. And like Abraham, we have to work as partners with God. God can give power and God can reward faith, but we have to exercise that faith and we need to step out and act in faith if we are going to be able to receive the full blessing and the benefit that God is extending to each one of us. And like Abraham, we have to be witnesses for God. Abraham was living in a land of immorality, wickedness, and evil, and yet he was a constant light to the truth. There were many people who were converted and became followers of God through the work of Abraham. Like Abraham, those of us living in Japan, we are surrounded by a non-Christian environment. 99% of the people in Japan are non-Christian. And we have to be lights to those around us through our words and more importantly, through our deeds. How do we live each day? Are we living a life of love? Are we living a life of faith? Or are we just like everybody else? We cannot be assimilated into the place and land in which we live. We are surrounded by temptation and by evil, and yet we must be a light in the darkness to those around us so that they too can find the truth that we have and that we treasure. So each day, I challenge you to, like Abraham, walk in faith with God. Let God be your partner. And if you trust in God each day, as Abraham trusted, like Abraham, you too can be blessed. And you can be a blessing to the people around you as well. And others will find God through you and your witness. Thank you.
For our closing song, let's open our hymnal on page 100. Great is thy faithfulness. This time.
Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Let us pray. Dear Father, we know that your faithfulness is great for us each day. And may our faith be strong in you, so that we can secure the power that you offer to each one of us each day. May we faithfully walk with you and witness to those around us, so that the world may know more about you. Is my prayer in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Hello, hi. So we have some guests that walk in after the official greetings, and we like to welcome our guests. So all the guests that walked in after and didn't have an official greeting, please stand. Yes. Can you please tell us your name and where you're from?
My name is Julian, and I'm from Chicago.
Chicago,
I'm Hussein from Guatemala.
Guatemala.
I'm Marcella, and I'm from South Bend, Indiana. I'm Ella Nicholas, and I'm from Michigan.
Michigan,
Justina, I'm from Kenya.
Kenya. Good. Welcome. So everyone, give them a round of applause. Yes. Well,
Who are you?
oh,
We're on the plane together, I know that.
We came here from Maryland, from America, from Maryland,
okay.
precise.
And I'm Greg, so nice to see you all again.
Yeah, because I know those faces. Yeah. He played the piano too, right? Yeah. Yeah, so one more thing here. On the 4-4, it's potluck. So please join us. Yes. Don't just go. Yes. Come. Yes. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
I'll bring my flag next week.
Next time, I'm pointing our hands.
I can tell the accent.